Okay, welcome. We're doing a deep dive today, looking at some really interesting source material that focuses very specifically on the big legal challenges the Trump administration has faced since returning to office. We're looking at the picture as of about June 2025.
That's right. And the source we're digging into today, it really argues that the legal system has, well, it's become this very visible front line, you could say, against certain executive actions.
Visible feels almost like an understatement, doesn't it? The material points to just an unprecedented surge. We're talking, what, over 325 lawsuits by June 25?
Yeah, something like that. And the source presents this as reflecting some pretty profound institutional resistance.
Definitely. So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is really to unpack what this particular source tells us about some of the biggest cases in this wave.
Right. We want to understand the why behind them, the context, where they stand now, according to the source, and, the deeper implications the source is suggesting.
And just to be clear, we're not here to take sides on the politics. We're really focused on what this material lays out about how the legal system is sort of testing the boundaries of presidential power.
Exactly. And how it reflects these ongoing tensions within the American system of governance based on what we're reading here.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The source kicks things off with what it calls maybe the most consequential suit. It's the one challenging the administration's move to freeze almost $3 trillion in federal funds meant for states.
3 trillion. That's just a staggering number. And the source does note the administration's reasoning or stated reasoning. It was an austerity measure, aimed at streamlining government, cutting waste.
But the material quickly pivots to the critics' view.
Right. The source says they saw it very differently, more like a veiled attempt to punish states that weren't politically aligned, maybe force them into compliance on other issues.
And the potential fallout described in the source, it wasn't small.
No, not at all. The source details how it could really disrupt essential stuff. Medicaid, funding for public schools, transportation, even disaster relief. Things that affect people directly.
So how did this play out in the courts? The source says things moved fast.
Incredibly fast. Trial judges, they issued temporary injunctions pretty quickly. Those are basically court orders hitting pause on the action.
And then it went higher to the Supreme Court.
Yes, and this is key, according to the source. The Supreme Court's involvement was interesting. It seems they actually sided with the administration once on this issue.
Oh, okay.
But then twice after that, they upheld lower court rulings that blocked the cuts, that restored aid, and the source points to the U.S. Agency for International Development as one specific example where funding got restored because of these rulings.
So kind of a mixed signal from the top court, but leaning towards blocking the freeze in the end, at least twice.
Right, and the source emphasizes it's not over yet. Oral arguments are apparently scheduled for the fall term, so states are likely, digging in for a longer fight.
Okay, so beyond the direct state funding, the source then talks about challenges hitting the structure of government itself, federal workers and independent agencies.
Yeah, this involves things like large-scale dismissals of federal employees, attempts to dismantle certain independent agencies.
The source points to a specific case here.
It does. Dellinger v. Besant. This one challenged the firing of oversight officials without cause being shown. And interestingly, the source notes this was the first case of this type, this specific wave, to actually make it all the way to the Supreme Court.
And the outcome. What does the source say happened there?
Well, the court ruled against the administration, ordered reinstatement for those officials.
Okay.
And the source really highlights that the court seemed to affirm this principle that Congress, not necessarily the president alone, has significant authority over how these federal agencies are structured and how independent they are.
And there was related litigation, too.
Yeah, the source connects this to other lawsuits that managed to block a separate but related move, the attempt to unilaterally get rid of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
Right, the CFPB, which, the source is quick to point out, many saw as a direct hit against consumer rights and financial regulation generally.
Exactly. So the source uses these cases, Dellinger, the CFPB fight, to illustrate this idea of the judiciary acting, in some views, as a kind of guardian for these agencies.
Protecting the public interest from potentially unchecked executive action.
That's the dynamic the source describes. The courts stepping in to assert, a protective role over these institutions.
All right, now this next area, the source describes it as maybe the most novel and definitely controversial set of lawsuits.
You must mean the whole situation with the administration's partnership with Elon Musk's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency.
That's the one. DOJ. The source says this partnership alone has generated something like 39 separate lawsuits.
Wow, 39. And the issues being fought over in court are pretty fundamental, according to the source.
Like what?
Things like whether this setup complies with federal records laws, how government activities are supposed to be documented, and also just how much authority Musk actually has in this public-private kind of deal.
And who's bringing these suits?
The source mentions plaintiffs like public interest groups, former government officials, and their argument, as laid out in the material, is basically that this partnership blurs the line between public power and private influence in a dangerous way.
Raising concerns about what? Transparency? Privacy?
Exactly. Transparency, data privacy, and just the general worry about private companies having too much sway over how the government runs. That's what the source flags.
So where do these cases stand legally?
Well, the source says courts have mostly denied requests for preliminary injunctions, those immediate halts. However, it also says the courts have made it pretty clear they plan to scrutinize this whole arrangement much more closely as the cases proceed.
Which seems to fit the broader picture the source paints. This kind of growing unease in legal circles about privatizing government functions.
Yeah, and what that might mean for the usual checks and balances. The source definitely presents it as uncharted legal territory.
Okay, moving on from those maybe structural and novel challenges, the source shifts gears a bit to social issues, civil rights, social policy, specifically mentioning protections for transgender Americans.
Right, focusing on administration actions aimed at rolling back some of those protections.
And the source lists affected areas like access to medical care, prison placement issues, participation in student athletics. Several different fronts. And predictably, this led to lawsuits.
A whole wave of them, yeah. Filed by advocacy groups, by individuals directly affected, all trying to block these changes.
What's the status there, legally speaking?
According to the source, it's a bit mixed right now, but federal judges have issued temporary holds on some of the more controversial measures.
Any examples?
Yeah, the source specifically mentions judges halting the transfer of transgender women inmates into male prison facilities, for instance. But other parts of these policies are still being actively fought over in court.
The source seems to frame this as more than just policy disputes.
It does. It suggests this whole area is kind of emblematic of a bigger struggle playing out in the courts about what equality really means today.
And the role of the courts in protecting minority groups, maybe.
Exactly. Protecting vulnerable populations, as the source puts it, from actions potentially driven by, majority views or political wins.
Okay, another area that always seems to generate legal fights, and the source confirms it's happening again, is immigration policy.
Yeah, consistently a flashpoint. The source highlights several actions drawing challenges.
Such as?
Efforts to apprehend immigrants, even in places like churches or temples, attempts to expel certain legal residents, and a really significant push, apparently, to cancel the legal status of thousands of foreign students already here studying.
Wow. And the court's reaction?
Immediate challenges, according to the source. And injunctions, those court-ordered pauses, again, have temporarily stopped many of these enforcement actions, like the apprehensions and expulsions.
What about the student status issue? That sounds like a big one.
It was. The source actually details how that specific push led to dozens of lawsuits all at once. And facing that kind of sustained judicial resistance, the administration ultimately walked it back.
So the legal pressure worked there, according to the source.
The source presents it as a direct result, yes. Yeah. A clear example of the courts pushing back effectively.
And these immigration cases, the source says, they really highlight this ongoing debate.
Yeah, the fundamental debate about where the lines are, the limits of executive power in immigration enforcement, and what rights non-citizens have under U.S. law. It's playing out very actively in the courts.
Now, this next category the source discusses is, well, it's striking because it involves the legal profession itself being targeted.
Ah, right. The executive orders aimed at specific high-profile law firms.
Yeah, the source names firms like Perkins Coie, Paul Weiss, WilmerHale.
And it recounts how the administration accused these firms of various types of unethical conduct.
And tried to impose penalties.
Pretty severe ones, yeah. Things like revoking security clearances for lawyers at the firms, canceling government contracts they held.
And the reaction from the broader legal community.
Widespread condemnation, according to the source. They saw it as an abuse of power, basically intended to scare off other law firms from taking on cases against the administration. A chilling effect.
So the firms sued back.
They did. The source explains their lawsuits argued these orders violated fundamental rights, First Amendment rights of association and speech, plus due process rights.
And how have the courts responded so far?
They've issued temporary restraining orders, TROs, which are like very quick, short-term injunctions, and these TROs have blocked most parts of those executive orders for now.
What reason did the courts give?
The material mentions the courts citing that very chilling effect concern and stressing how vital, robust legal advocacy is for democracy to function properly. It's a pretty direct pushback.
The judiciary basically defending the lawyers who challenged the executive.
That's how the source portrays it, a significant moment in this whole dynamic.
Okay, what about transparency? Government accountability. The source says that's another battleground.
Definitely, particularly around how the administration is handling official records.
Is there a specific case mentioned?
Yes, one filed by the Project on Government Oversight. It challenges this practice of classifying certain agency records as presidential records.
Why is that classification significant?
Because, as the source explains, labeling them presidential records could shield them from public access requests under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA.
So hiding them from public view, essentially.
That's the concern being raised in the lawsuit. Now, the source does note that as of May 2025, a preliminary injunction in that specific case was denied.
So the practice continues for now.
It seems so, in that instance. But the source stresses that this case, and others like it, are important because they keep highlighting these ongoing worries about government transparency potentially eroding.
The public's right to know what the government is doing.
Exactly. That fundamental principle is at the heart of these disputes, according to the source.
All right, let's turn to the environment. The source indicates major regulatory changes there have also led to a lot of court action.
Oh, absolutely. Big time. This includes things like trying to restructure the Department of the Interior significantly, rolling back regulations related to climate change, weakening protections for endangered species.
A broad front of changes.
Very broad. And the source gives an example, a suit by the Center for Biological Diversity. They're challenging whether the administration followed the rules, specifically Federal Advisory Committee laws, when it went about restructuring the Interior Department.
And the overall response to these environmental moves?
Fierce resistance, the source says. Coming from environmental groups, state attorneys general, it's resulted in what the material calls a really complex patchwork of court injunctions and ongoing legal fights across many different environmental issues.
So no single clear outcome yet, but lots of active battles.
Precisely. The source presents it as emblematic of these larger fights happening in the courts over environmental protection and how much regulatory oversight the federal government should have.
Okay, beyond those main categories, the source also briefly mentions some other high-profile cases adding to the overall volume.
Right. Just touches on them, but notes legal challenges related to attempts to end federal support for DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion.
What else?
Also efforts to restrict birthright citizenship, and even moves to exclude certain media outlets from White House press briefings.
And the status of those.
Similar story, according to the source. Many are still unresolved legally, but they've often prompted courts to issue temporary pauses while they figure things out.
And the source connects these to pretty big themes, right?
Yeah, it emphasizes that these cases, even if some seem smaller, have really far-reaching implications for things like civil rights, freedom of the press, and sort of the nation's basic commitment to pluralism.
So if we zoom out now, look at the whole picture this source material paints.
Yeah.
The sheer volume is the first thing that hits you.
It really is remarkable. And the source even mentions there are dozens more lawsuits beyond the ones we've discussed in detail, touching on voting rights, reproductive health, labor issues, even the independence of the judiciary itself.
It really reinforces what the source calls a, quote, profound moment in American governance.
Yeah. And the argument presented is that when you see states, advocacy groups, ordinary citizens turning to the courts on this massive scale.
What does that signal?
The source suggests it signals a kind of crisis of confidence, a lack of faith, maybe, in the executive branch sticking to constitutional norms, and also a real determination by these groups to use the legal system as a tool to preserve the rule of law.
So these aren't just technical squabbles over regulations.
Not according to this source, no. It frames them as a fundamental stress test for the whole system of checks and balances, people seeking protection in the courts from what they see as executive overreach.
Making the courts the main arena right now.
Absolutely. The central stage, you might say, where these critical boundaries of presidential power are being actively debated, challenged, and potentially redrawn.
And what's the impact on the administration itself? according to the source?
Well, it suggests this constant litigation acts as two things. One, a break, it slows down or stops policies from being implemented.
Okay.
And two, it acts as a kind of barometer showing the depth and breadth of the opposition the administration's agenda is facing.
So let's try to boil down the main takeaway from this source material we've been discussing.
I think it's pretty clear. The source argues the legal system, through this absolutely unprecedented flood of lawsuits, has become the primary place where the limits of presidential power are being fought over and defined right now.
And why should you, listening, care about all this? Well, because these cases aren't abstract legal theory. They touch on really fundamental things about how your government works.
Yeah, they can impact your rights directly, and they're constantly shifting that delicate balance of power within the U.S. system.
The source leaves us with a pretty powerful final thought to chew on. It talks about the outcomes of this intense legal ferment, as it calls it.
Right, suggesting that how these cases turn out won't just shape specific policies, it could fundamentally affect whether our institutions can actually maintain that crucial balance between government authority and individual rights.
It even suggests, quite dramatically, that these outcomes could play a role in determining the future path of the republic itself.
It definitely makes you pause, thinking about what this source shows us, this intense period of legal challenge. What does it really tell us about the health and maybe the future direction of American democracy right now?